So continuing on with Chapter 9, the Confederation and the Constitution, this is Part 2 of the creation of the U.S. Constitution. So obviously after Shays' Rebellion, this is an eye-opener to the Founding Fathers that changes have to happen. But how do we balance between a strong central government and maintaining states' rights? Because obviously there is still a large part of the United States that wants to ensure that states' rights are not trampled. To add insult to injury, even after Shays' Rebellion, the commerce problems become a real issue, meaning trade between the states. A convention was called in Annapolis in order to discuss these tariffs that were being charged against the different states, etc. Only 5 of the states showed up to this meeting. So this is a wake-up call. It's time to change the articles. It's time to revise them at the very least. And so a convention was called together in Philadelphia in 1787 in order to revise the Articles of Confederation. Rhode Island did not show up. But very quickly, the Founding Fathers realized that the articles don't need revision, they need completely replaced. We need to scrap them and start over from scratch. And so the convention in Philadelphia was held completely in secret in order to ensure that the Founding Fathers were able to discuss these issues with one another without fear that the people back home would find out about it. They would not release their plan until everything was said and done. And Thomas Jefferson, who was in France at the time, looking at this assemblage of men, called them demigods, that if this is a group that you want writing a constitution, these are the guys to go to. All of them had experience writing their own state constitutions. They'd all participated in some way with the Revolutionary War. So these are the guys you want creating a new government. People like George Washington, Ben Franklin, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, etc., etc. What they all had in common, all of them came from the upper class. There wasn't anyone from that debtor class, that Daniel Shays class, in order to voice their pro-inflation perspective. 19 of them owned slaves, and their major focus was on preserving the United States. Now, to them, to this wealthy property-owning class, how do you preserve the United States? You protect property rights. So from the Declaration of Independence, where we declared that we have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, to the U.S. Constitution, where you have a right to life, liberty, and property. So the focus is on property rights, specifically because these are the men who own property. But even with that being said, they want to protect this Republican experiment. They don't want to do away with citizen participation in the government. They just want to modify it a little bit so that they could stop that mobocracy where the common people are running wild through the streets, where they're raising rebellions. They want to be able to enforce tariff issues. They want to be able to enforce currency issues. So it's just a minor modification of the republicanism that they'd seen under the Articles of Confederation. Here is obviously a picture of these men in Philadelphia, George Washington being the chairman of the convention. And so the U.S. Constitution is just really a bundle of compromises. To begin with, the question that these Founding Fathers had to ask themselves is, what will our legislative branch look like? How will we make the laws? So 2 plans were really proposed, a Virginia plan, or the large state plan, and the New Jersey plan, or the small state plan. Now, the Virginia plan obviously was to favor the large states like Virginia. They called for a 2-house legislature, both of these houses being based on population, meaning the larger your state, the more representation in Congress you would receive. Now, to the small states, this was a terrible idea. They felt that they would be completely lost in the shuffle with this large state plan. So they proposed the New Jersey plan, or the small state plan, to keep it exactly how it was under the Articles of Confederation, a 1-house legislature where each state got 1 vote. But the problem there is that is an overrepresentation of the small states like Rhode Island. Why should a small state like Rhode Island get just as much of a say as a large state like Pennsylvania? And so a compromise was made, the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Plan, where to create a system, which is exactly what we have today, a 2-house legislature One house, the House of Representatives, would be based on population, to favor obviously the large states, and the second house, or the Senate, where each state gets 2 senators regardless of size. So this is exactly what the United States has today, combining the Virginia and New Jersey plan into a great compromise. Now, beyond the way the laws would be made with the legislative branch, they also compromised to create a strong executive branch. Now, this is a change from the Articles, where there was no chief executive, to create a president of the United States and a branch to go with him, whose job is to enforce the laws, to ensure that the rebellion that happened in Philadelphia or Shays' Rebellion doesn't happen again, to create a strong central figure like a president who is a commander-in-chief, who has the power to appoint federal judges, and who has the power to veto legislation in order to ensure that the U.S. government is going the way that it's supposed to. Now, some other compromises that were made was to create an electoral college. Now, this is a safeguard against the mob. Also, this is to ensure that the states retain some of their power when it comes to voting for president. So instead of a popular election on a national basis when voting for the president, we now today have a popular election when voting for president on a statewide basis. So each presidential candidate has the amount of electors for each state based on the number of representatives they have and the number of senators they have. This also serves as a safeguard to ensure that the common people are making the right decision, that if in doubt, the Electoral College can change their mind and they can vote for who they want to as president. Now, if the Electoral College does not have a clear majority, the election for president was to be thrown to the House of Representatives. Another compromise that was made was the 3/5 compromise, or the 3/5 clause in the Constitution. The South said, we want to be able to have more representation in the House of Representatives. Therefore, we want to count each of our slaves as a full person when it comes to representation. The North said, how is that fair? How is it possible for you to count each of your slaves as a whole person when they are not a citizen of the United States? You consider them property. So they wanted slaves to be counted as 0 people. The compromise that was made was that each slave in the South would be counted as 3/5 of a person. This would give the South more representation in the House of Representatives, but also they had to pay more in taxes as a result. So it was a balance. So this isn't that they considered slaves 3/5 of a person. They didn't consider them people at all. They considered them property. But this is for purposes of representation. The South gets more representation in Congress, and vice versa. They also have to pay more in taxes as a result. Now, speaking of slavery, there was a large part of the Constitutional Convention that was focused on abolishing slavery altogether. But the problem once again comes in that if they demanded the abolition of slavery, the South would have seceded right then and there in 1787. They would have formed their own country right in 1787. So in order to ensure that the South stayed tied to the United States, in order to keep the United States together, they agreed on a compromise to not abolish slavery altogether, but to abolish the foreign slave trade after 1807. So after 1807, it was illegal to import slaves from Africa. Slavery was not gotten rid of. You could still sell your slaves from one state to another. It just became illegal to sell slaves or to buy slaves that were coming in from Africa. Now, when looking at the Constitutional Convention, the delegates really had a lot more in common than they had differences among them. Number one, all of them are from that wealthy property-owning class, so therefore they wanted to create a government that focused on the protection of property. They wanted to create a government that had a strong monetary system. Of course they did, because they're the ones that owned the money. Therefore, create a strong central government that is going to protect our property, aka our money. And so they created 3 equal branches, each of which had checks and balances on the other branches in order to ensure not only a balance within the government, but in order to check the mob as well. This fear of the mob, or this fear of the common people, really pushed the Founding Fathers to put these safeguards to ensure that that mobocracy of Shays' Rebellion never happened again. For example, all federal judges were to be appointed for life. They could never be voted out of office because they are appointed by the president. The president and senators up until the 1900s would be indirectly elected. The president, obviously, with that safeguard of the Electoral College, and senators were actually chosen by state legislatures up until the early 1900s. And even for the one house that the common people could vote on directly, the House of Representatives, there were still property requirements put in place to ensure that only a certain group of white, over the age of 21-year-old men were able to vote for the House of Representatives. But even with all of these safeguards put in place, this protection against the mob, this protection against the common people, the U.S. Constitution is still founded on republicanism, that the government is based on the consent of the governed, that the people are the ones choosing their government. More so than any other country in the world at this time, the United States really is a republican form of government. And here you see an original copy, obviously housed at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. So in September of 1787, 39 delegates signed the Constitution. But it doesn't end there. Just because these 39 delegates say, hey, this Constitution is awesome, doesn't mean that the Constitution automatically goes into effect. They had to present it to the people of the United States. They had to have it ratified by the states in order for it to go into effect. Now, the problem was that under the Articles of Confederation, any change to the Articles required unanimous ratification by all of the states. Well, Rhode Island never showed up to the Philadelphia Convention. So the Founding Fathers really sidestepped this issue by saying, when 9 of the 13 states ratify the Constitution will go into effect for those 9 states. And until those other 4 states decide to ratify, they will be left out in the cold of the U.S. Constitution. So really it was creating peer pressure on any state that did not want to ratify the Constitution in order to get in on this game. So when the founders presented the Constitution to the people, 2 groups formed within the United States. One side was the Antifederalists. These are people that do not want a strong central government. They are in favor of states' rights. They were against the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. So from the Anti-Federalist perspective, these are mostly people from that debtor class, small farmers, backcountry people, the states' rights advocates. To them, the Constitution was really the wealthy class stealing away their power, creating a strong central government where these poor debtor class people were really losing all their power. And not only that, but they said, where is the Bill of Rights? Where is the protection for individual liberties? This really created a lot of fear among the lower classes, that the Constitution was going to steal away their power. On the other side of the coin are the Federalists. These are the groups, this is the group of people in favor of ratifying the U.S. Constitution. They are obviously the most powerful and influential men of the era. They were wealthy, they were educated, and because they had so much wealth, they are also the men who controlled the newspapers in the U.S. at this time. So the newspapers of the day, controlled by the Federalists, were really pushing for the ratification of the U.S. Constitution in order to get this to be the new form of government. In the state of New York, when New York was deciding whether or not to accept the Constitution or not, a group of Federalists led by Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison printed a series of articles in the New York newspapers that collectively have become known as the Federalist Papers. Now, this series of essays or newspaper articles was focused on why the state of New York should ratify the U.S. Constitution. These are their arguments why the U.S. Constitution is awesome. And specifically, Federalist Paper number 10, and there was a whole series of them, but Federalist Paper number 10 really was an answer to the Anti-Federalist fear. The Anti-Federalists were fearful that republicanism cannot function in a large territory, that we can't see such a large country like the United States and actually be able to create a government where the people are part of it. The Anti-Federalists were worried that the wealthy would eventually take over and either establish a monarchy or a dictatorship. Federalist Paper number 10 refutes this idea that yes, we can have a Republican-style government in a large territory like the United States. And here are the reasons why. So the Federalist Papers went a long way to not only get the state of New York to ratify the U.S. Constitution, but other states as well. Until finally, 9 of the 13 states ratified, and the U.S. Constitution went into effect. And that is Chapter 9.